defining a few different terms. And so the first term I'd like to look at defining is biosphere. But before I actually go through and discuss the actual definition, but first would be a good idea to actually break down that term. So let's first look at bio. When we look at this prefix bio, what we're looking at is anything that is really associated with life. So for example, if you think of biology, biology is the study of living organisms, or biography. This is an account of someone's life written by another person. So that bio means life. And so biosphere, we're talking about anywhere, any area on Earth where life can be found. And this can include on land, in the water, or in the air. Now our second term, and here we see that prefix again, bio. And so biome, we're looking at the largest division of a biosphere, which will have similar biotic and abiotic components. And in a moment, we're going to break those two terms down. But what I mean by biome is that this is an area in which they have similar characteristics, and you would see similar plants. You would see similar adaptations in animals. So they can be close together or they could be far apart. For example, the biome here in BC, it can be the same biome that is similar in New Zealand. So often when people travel to New Zealand, they say that it actually looks like our coastal regions in. So I'm going to keep on coming back to this diagram, but what I wanted to show you so far is what we've talked about. Here's really the big category. This is the big picture. We've talked about the biosphere, which is life on Earth. And then we've also just briefly broke down biomes. So these were regions that had similar characteristics. We're also going to break down these other terms a little bit later in this podcast. So in order for us to describe the biomes, we talk about two different types of components. And here is that prefix again, bio, so meaning life. So biotic is the living parts of a biome or an environment. So I'd like you to take a moment and pause the video, and I'd like you to think about all of the things, living things that you would find within a biome. And now that you've thought about the living things within that biome, I'd like you to take a moment and think about the abiotic components. Now let's first break that term down again. So we all know we already have this prefix in here. There's that bio. And now we've added on this extra bit here, this a. So I want you to think of when I talk about something that is asymmetrical or doesn't have symmetry. This means without. And so often in science, when we add this a before a common term, whoops, that should be without. When we add this prefix before a common term, this means without life. So abiotic means the non-living parts of an environment. So take a moment now, pause the video, and come back when you've written out a list within your chart. What I'd like you to do with this diagram is I'd like you to take two different colors. And in one color, I'd like you to circle all the things that you can see that are associated with biotic factors. And in another color, I'd like you to circle the things that are associated with non-living or abiotic factors. So pause the video and come back when you're done your circling. Okay, so hopefully you have circled in one color a lot of the living things. They can be aquatic, they can be like small fish or the larger fish. They could be lilies, for example, or they could be phytoplankton that we might find within an aquatic environment. So any sort of plants on land or in the aquatic system, and anything in air. So remember, these are biotic factors that are in land, water, and air. As for our abiotic factors, they're not as easy to point out. We would see things like air, water, maybe dissolved gases that we might find either in the air or in an aquatic system. Sun would be another example of an abiotic factor. And so as you saw in that previous diagram, it's not typically one biotic factor that you find. It's a multitude of different biotic factors that you would find that contribute to that biome. And all of those factors that we find, that is known as biodiversity. So again, here's that term again, bio meaning life, diversity meaning variety, so that there's a variety of life within biomes if I reverse those words. Okay, now that we've talked about biosphere and biome, we need to break down the term ecosystem. So ecosystem is just a part of the biome where abiotic and biotic components interact. Now again, this can be a very large or a very small area. And biomes will contain many different types of ecosystems. Habitat is what we would find within an ecosystem, and this is a place where an organism lives. And species is a group of closely related organisms that can reproduce with one another, and in that they produce fertile offspring, and that's a key term with species. Now, continuing on, if we're looking at a population that we would find, a population, as you see here, a population are all the members of a particular species that we would find within that ecosystem. And a community are all the populations of different species that interact within a specific ecosystem. So when we're looking at this chart here, this diagram, I keep on coming back to this chart because this is what we would call the ecological hierarchy. So it's goes from most encompassing down to the very individual level. And so many individuals make up a population, populations that interact make up a community, communities that we would find that interact together make up an ecosystem, the multiple ecosystems make up our biomes, and our biomes are composed within our biosphere. So now that I've just quickly introduced that term, what I'd like you to do in your notes is take a moment and determine based off of this chart here, where you would place each of the terms above. So pause the video and take a moment to do that and come back when you're finished. So hopefully you determined that the smallest circle that exists here is representing an organism. Many organisms make up a population. Populations make up communities. Communities make up ecosystems, which make up biomes, which are all found within the biosphere. Now here's the question to start off the next part of our vodcast. I've already kind of briefly talked about it within this podcast, but why are there places in the world that are very far apart, but yet they look very similar to each other? If you were thinking that it is because they might have similar characteristics of abiotic factors and biotic factors, then you'd be correct. And what this makes up is that the world's biomes. So we have 8 different biomes that we need to identify. The boreal forest, or also known as the taiga forest, the deserts, grasslands, polar ice, temperate deciduous rainforest, tropical rainforest, and tundra. Now we're going to be going through all of these in a little bit of more detail in class, but I just want to give you a brief sneak peek for now. So I want you to think of the places that you might have seen or that you might have traveled to and see if in your notes that you can identify these biomes that are represented in the picture below. Okay, because we're going to be going through these biomes in a lot of detail in class, I'm just going to give you the quick overview and the answers to the diagram because we're going to be looking at pictures in each individual biome in detail later on. Okay, based off of the knowledge that you currently have, I want you to try to determine a key for each of these biomes that are listed in your notes. So this diagram is given to you in your notes, and I'd like you to try to guess on what each of those 1 through 8 biomes are. Please do it in pencil so that you can erase it if you're not correct. So pause the video now, give it an attempt on your own, and come back when you think that you've filled out as much as you can. Okay, and here is the key for that biome chart that is listed below. And again, I'm not going to spend much time here because we are going to go through this in more detail in class. So in your data booklet that you'll be given on a provincial exam and for any chapter quiz or unit test, you'll always be given a key that a diagram like this that you'll be able to refer to in order to determine the appropriate biomes. So now that we've had a sneak peek at the different biomes, I'd like to just quickly mention the factors that influence the characteristics and distribution of these biomes. There's a few different characteristics, one of which is precipitation. So if you can think of example in the tropical rainforest, in order to get those luscious forests, that you need to have a lot of precipitation. Another one is temperature. Warm temperatures compared to cool temperatures. We can also have latitude, which we're going to discuss, elevation, as well as ocean currents. Now, the 2 most important are the precipitation and temperature in determining the characteristics of that biome. And so our 2 most important abiotic factors that contribute to the biome characteristics are temperature and precipitation. Now, precipitation often we think of as rain. I think it might be because we live in Victoria, but precipitation can include rainfall, snow, mist, as well as fog. And so precipitation is not just rainfall. So because these are our two primary abiotic factors, we're often given this graph and showing the distribution of the different biomes that occur based off of high precipitation and high annual temperatures, and as compared to low precipitation down here and low average annual temperatures. So this graph is also given to you on quizzes and tests and provincial exams. And what you'll need to know is how to read this graph. There's no memorization that needs to occur. You just need to know how to use this graph. So what I've done is I've just included a few questions, A through D, and I'd like you to use that graph in order to answer each of these questions. So pause the video, use that graph, and determine your answers for A through D, and then come back when you are finished. So hopefully you got those questions A through D correct. So we've talked about two abiotic factors already, temperature and precipitation. So the third abiotic factor that we need to discuss is latitude. And this refers to the degrees measured north. So this was north from the equator, and then as well as south from the equator. So the equator, we consider this line right here, we consider this 0 degrees. Now, the reason why we look at this when we're determining biomes is because the temperature at the equator is fairly constant. So we've got a fairly constant temperature at the equator. So the reason why we have a lot of precipitation at the equator is because that air is really warm, and warm air can hold moisture better than cold air can. This would be the reason why in polar areas the air is so cold that it does not pick up the moisture, and there's very little precipitation, even in the way of snow. There is very little snow that actually comes down in those polar areas. All right, a few other terms that we have to talk about. The Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and they signify basically the outliers of the tropical zone. So from the equator to both of those tropics, we would consider all that area in there the tropical zone. And so this is where we tend to see more direct sunlight, and it's more even to sunlight all throughout the year. So outside of that tropical zone, we don't tend to see the heat and the precipitation like we see within that tropical zone. And this is because of the angle at which the sun's rays hit the earth. In the temperate zones, those sun's rays start to hit the earth at an angle. And because they're hitting them at the angle, it covers off a larger area. And so that larger area results in less intense sun and therefore cooler temperatures. So therefore, it's going to experience the seasonal rainfall patterns, and this is due to the collisions of the cold and warm air masses. The fourth abiotic factor is elevation. Now, this refers to the height of a land mass above sea level. So in this diagram here, we're looking at sea level. Here would be the sea that I'm shading in blue so that you can see that this is where the sea would be. And you can see on this side of the diagram that elevation is talking about the distance above sea level. So in general, the reason why we talk about this is because in general, as the higher that you go, the cooler it is and the less precipitation falls. And so therefore, if we have a very high mountain range that is high above sea level, we are likely going to see that as we move up that mountainous range, that we are going to see a change in biome. And with elevation in mountainous ranges, what we also tend to see is that the windward side of a landmass receives lots of precipitation. So you'll see a different type of biome that would have lots of green vegetation that would occur on the windward side. And on the other side of that mountain range is where we would see on the leeward side, we'd see lots of dry air. And so you could have a desert biome on the leeward side of that mountain range. So the fifth and final abiotic factor needing to consider when looking at biomes are ocean currents. And the